now my honor and pleasure to invite Ambassador Kanwal Sibal to speak. Let me introduce Ambassador Sibal. He's a former Foreign Secretary of India, and he has served as India's ambassador to major countries, France, Russia, Turkey, and Egypt. In 2017, he was conferred the Padma Shri Award by the President of India. Not many know about two things about him. One is that he loves writing poetry. He has a book of poems to his credit, probably more on the way. It's called Snowflakes of Time. While researching his resume, I figured out that he's also the first Grand Doctor of Philosophy in India. Ambassador Sibal, I would like you to focus on, essentially the G11 concept from the Indian perspective, so to say. What's in it for India? What are our strategic gains from joining such a grouping? Prime Minister Modi sounded quite positive, even enthusiastic about the idea. Some say that it's a counter-China club primarily. Is there a danger that we are getting sucked into some sort of China containment gang up? But more importantly, please first you should address what's in it for India, how we can leverage G11 to remold or mold a new world order. Over to you, Ambassador.
Well, firstly, in G7 or G8, China was not present. And therefore, if China remains absent from G10 or G11, it is nothing new. Despite that, over the years, China has become the second largest economy in the world. And the volume of commercial and trade investment between China and the G7 countries is huge. But that did not convince the G7 to include China for the reasons that the Australian High Commissioner has mentioned, that G7 free market democracies originally as a instability that this was causing. So therefore, I wouldn't bother too much about the China factor, and there's absolutely no reason. Why India should have any hesitation of joining this group in order not to send any so-called adverse signal to China. Even more importantly, if you come to the whole concept of the Indo-Pacific, or the Quad, or the Malabar exercises, or the India, US, Japan summits, or the logistic access arrangements that India has signed with the US, with Australia, with France, and possibly with Japan shortly. These are all steps or concepts that China can interpret as being directed against China, but we are there, and we are going ahead in this direction. So the fact that Trump has launched this concept of the G10 or G11, China has kept out, to my mind, is fairly irrelevant to the debate. That is one. The other, of course, is that this G10, G11 thing is still, as was rightly said, is something of a work in progress. The fact that Trump had announced it is itself problematic for some countries because of his record in handling foreign policy. And it is unrealistic of him to propose that this meeting be held in September on the margins of the UN General Assembly or before the US elections. I don't think there will be many buyers for this. People will want to wait for the US elections to take place and to see who wins. If Trump wins, of course, then this concept can be promoted further. If Biden wins, then we'll have to see how the next US government tries to shape this concept. But the big problem is Russia. Now, U.S. Trump has also indicated that he would like Russia to join, quite apart from the domestic uh, uh, controversy in the United States. It's more than a controversy. The polarization that has taken place around the relationship with Russia, this is a non-starter. Number one. Number two, Russia itself has reacted in a lukewarm fashion, where Putin has said that he would join only if Russia is treated with respect. Uh, Now, assuming for a moment that Russia joins, my own feeling is that if the conditions are right, and if there is really a genuine consensus about Russia joining, and here, just for a moment, I'll also mention the European factors. The Europeans will resist uh, the inclusion of Russia until, of course, on Ukraine and on Crimea and other things, there is some forward movement to their satisfaction, because they have to handle not only public opinion in the major European countries, but the East European countries, Poland and the Baltic states would feel very strongly, and Ukraine will feel very strongly about this. But assuming for a moment that there is a consensus built and Russia joins, it'll be interesting, because I think Russia will join if the conditions were favorable. Then where is this whole issue about the China factor? Look at the Russia-China strategic ties; they're very deep. And if Russia joins, then clearly you have to then look at the whole G10, G11 in a very different light, and then you have to look at India's inclusion in that in relation to the China factor very differently, because the fact that India may join the grouping does not mean that India is going to join a Western alliance as such. And if Russia were to join, then the whole concern that somehow India is walking into a Western alliance, in inverted commas, would lose meaning, because Russia is not going to join any Western alliance. Now, if genuinely, as has been brought out by the Australian High Commissioner, there is a wide-ranging consensus, global consensus building up, that G7 or the G8 concept is of little relevance. In fact, the relevance of the G8 concept has already been exposed when the G20 was formed. It was clearly felt that G7, G8 was not good enough, and that you had to include other countries, and the G2 concept, the G2 grouping was established. So now, in the case of G10, G11, I think the Australian High Commissioner rightly pointed out that you bring the free market democracies together, but much more importantly, since a lot of action is in Asia and the Asia Pacific region, and China's biggest threat is in that region, then you have to get countries in this region who are concerned and who are the victims of Chinese expansionism and aggression, whether it is Japan or Australia. Well, Australia is not directly a victim of aggression as such, but then the manner in which China is treating Australia with all the sanctions and everything else, and India, there is a good reason for these countries to come together, and also to manage the whole concept of the Indo-Pacific and the freedom of navigation and freedom of overflights, not only in the Western Pacific, but freedom of navigation, protection of the sea lanes of communication in the Indian Ocean. You have to look ahead and see what China is planning. Not planning, actually, it is achieving that. It has got this China-Pakistan economic corridor, which gives them access to the Arabian Sea. They have this China-Myanmar economic corridor, which gives them access to the Bay of Bengal. So something which over centuries, at least the British tried to resist, Russia giving access to the warm waters of the Indian Ocean. Now, in changed circumstances, China is getting access to the warm waters of the Indian Ocean and creating security threats all around the littoral of the Indian Ocean countries. Now, if China, as was expected, had become a more open country, more democratic and more willing to abide by international law, one might have viewed China's expansionism somewhat differently, but the kind of authoritarian state it has become, and its ambitions clearly known and expressed, and wanting to now replace the United States as the foremost global power by 2049, and establishing timelines for that. And clearly very hegemonic and hierarchical in his thinking, where it cannot tolerate the idea of any country, especially in Asia, being an obstacle, and hence the pressure on India and Ladakh and everything else. Now, in that situation, you have to see China's expansion on the Asian landmass and its expansion in the Indian Ocean as two sides of the same coin. And it is very worrisome. It'll be for the first time in history, that any country would dominate the Asian landmass and would see, if not domination, at least a very important strategic position in the Indian Ocean. And all these two, the position on the landmass and the position on the Indian Ocean, is tied together through these two economic corridors. So it is a challenge for all countries. For the time being, I find that our partners are concentrating more on the sea. But I think that's a mistake, because the sea and the landmass are connected. And the whole Belt and Road Initiative on land, the Eurasian corridor, is linked to the maritime Silk Route. So therefore, they should look at it in totality, and therefore look at India's problem on land with China in the same optic as they see the Chinese expansion in the Indian Ocean as a common threat. So these are some of the initial thoughts I have. But last point, that of course, if India joins the G10, G11, it will certainly mean, and we should welcome that, stronger ties with the West. But the other question is of strategic autonomy. Do I have a minute or two? You have to unmute yourself. Yeah,
go ahead, Ambassador Sibal. Maybe a minute. We come back. There are quite a few things which you have.
Okay, let me just speak a minute on the strategic autonomy,
right,
because this is a bit of a bugbear for many of our Western friends, as somehow strategic autonomy means that we are not committed to a real relationship with the West, and we still have that bug of the non-alignment somewhere stuck in our DNA. But I put it to you, which is the country, and Ambassador Richard Verma is there, which is the country which protects, cherishes, and asserts its strategic autonomy the most in the world? Is the United States of America. China also protects its strategic autonomy, but leave aside China, it's a different system. But look at Europe. Even today, you look at the discourse of the French president and the statements he issues, he specifically refers to strategic autonomy, not only for France, but also for Europe. So strategic autonomy simply is a reflection of the power of a country. If you are like Japan, totally dependent for your defense on America, then you don't have strategic autonomy. Europe also is now festering a little bit because it doesn't have that much room for maneuver. I mean France, countries like France and others. So therefore, let's not look at strategic autonomy. Let's look at strategic autonomy in this light. A big country like India has to have strategic autonomy, but there's no contradiction between that and having a strong, mutually beneficial relationship with the West. Thank you.